All right, welcome everyone to the University of Maryland School of Public Health Alumni Network's inaugural event for the 2022 board term and panel discussion about food systems, race, and social determinants of health. Tonight's event is put on in partnership with the University of Maryland Black Alumni Network and will be recorded for those who can't join us this evening. I'm Jameson Roth, president of the School of Public Health Alumni Network and a graduate of the Family Science Bachelor's Degree Program, class of 2017. I'm joined by our Vice President, Jennifer Cleary, a graduate of the Community Health Bachelor's Degree Program, class of 2016. Also with us are board members, Dr. Jeanette Devine, a graduate of the Family Studies Program, Dr. Alyssa Todaro Brooks, a graduate of the Behavioral and Community Health Doctoral Program, class of 2016, and Dr. Chandria Jones, also a graduate of the Behavioral and Community Health Doctoral Program, class of 2014, in addition to numerous other board members. This event was organized by the University of Maryland School of Public Health Alumni Network in partnership with the School of Public Health and the University of Maryland Black Alumni Network, and is open to all UMD alumni, current students, and friends of the School of Public Health. The University of Maryland School of Public Health Alumni Network is dedicated to providing and partnering on virtual programs similar to today's experience. We hope that you will continue to partner with us and connect with us virtually and in person. Our network works to promote and support the school, encourage professional excellence, and facilitate career development for both current students and graduates while fostering a lasting relationship between the School of Public Health and its alumni. We encourage you to support our network by joining today. You can do so by visiting our website, sbh.umd.edu/sbh-alumni-network, and we will share that link in the chat momentarily. Your membership supports diverse programs and events curated just for our alumni community. I will serve as today's moderator for this conversation and guide us through a question and answer session with two top-line subject matter experts who are active in sectors related to research and scholarship as relates to food systems, race, and other social determinants of health, systems that govern and shape many factors that make up our daily lives, whether we find ourselves actively or passively interacting with them. There is a slight change to tonight's event. Angela Boadu is not able to be with us tonight. We will certainly miss her insights. I am thrilled to introduce our panelists, Dr. Psyche Williams-Forson and Dr. Jennifer Roberts. We're really excited to get started on this conversation with you both. For our attendees this evening, we encourage you to send your questions to us via the chat. Use the chat box, and you also have the option when we get to the Q&A section to repeat your question if you would like to make sure that it is answered. We'll be pulling the questions into a separate document during this event so we can make sure that all of the questions are answered in a timely manner. But we will get started with introductions. And with that, I will hand it off to Dr. Williams-Forson.
Great, thank you. Good evening. I'm Psyche Williams-Forson, professor and chair in the Department of American Studies here at the University of Maryland College Park. I am trained in the study of the material world. That is the things that we engage materially from our bodies to, well, to food. I'm the author of two single-authored monographs and an anthology, one of which is the award-winning Building Houses Out of Chicken Legs, Black Women, Food and Power, and the more recently released Eating While Black, Food Shaming and Race in America. And I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Great, and Dr. Jennifer Roberts, please come off mute and introduce yourself.
Sure. It's good to be here as well, share this panel with this distinguished panelists, and to see you all. I am an associate professor in the Department of Kinesiology in the School of Public Health, and my formal training is actually in environmental health science, and my scholarship pretty much centers around health inequities as related to the environments we live in, whether that's our built environment, so our man-made environment, or our natural environment, our social environment, and how those inequities, those structural inequities in those environments play a role in health disparities, particularly among marginalized populations. And again, I am happy to be here.
And we're so happy that you donated your time and your energy to helping us put on this event. Thank you both. We can get started with some questions. And I think for the flow of conversation, feel free to just shout out as you go along, Dr. Roberts and Dr. Williams-Forson. We'll start with what interested you in food systems and how or what made you decide to explore food systems through your current professional lens?
Dr. Roberts, you want to take that one, or?
Sure, I'll take a stab at it. In essence, to be completely 100% authentic, I look at food in a kind of a peripheral, tangential way. So for example, when I'm looking at the whole kind of paradigm of social determinants of health, one of the things that I may look at is the food environment. So I will look at aspects such as food deserts or food swamps and how those have an impact on the decisions we make in terms of the food that we put in our body. So I guess you could say I got interested in the food systems by way of looking at how all of these determinants from the time you're born, or even before in utero, to the time you die, how they can make an impact on your health and well-being. Was there another part to that question? I think that was it, right?
I think you got it. Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
Okay.
Okay, well, and so I come at food actually from a directly, but from a cultural point of view, right? So when I was in my graduate studies program, it was the late 90s, and it was a watershed moment in Black feminist thought. A number of Black women's work was being identified. Patricia Hill Collins, for example, had written her book, Black Feminist Thought. And so it was a really critical moment. And I was doing research for various professors and came across this notion of food waste, which was not something I was familiar with, a term I wasn't familiar with. And, you know, you pull the thread. And when I pulled the thread, because I wasn't sure if Black people had food waste, and we do. And so it sort of evolved from there. And this work became my doctoral thesis, where I was really interested in stereotypes surrounding African-American people, Black people, throughout the African diaspora. Specifically, I was interested in Black people's association with foods like chicken and watermelon. And then, you know, I got to a point where it became a very depressing topic, because of the plethora of images that are left over from enslavement, Reconstruction, up until today. And my focus shifted to the ways in which Black people have been creative with food. And so that really is how I got started on this journey, more through a cultural lens than anything else.
Got it. Very fascinating, the way we all come to this shared interest in this topic. For our next question, I would say, how has your work changed over the course of your careers as the ideas communicated around food and food systems by society have evolved over time?
Well, I'll start and say that when I started studying food in the 90s, it was considered, probably too, because I was outside of the world of nutrition. It was really considered scholarship light because it was very much situated in the realm of women and women's work. And most people were focused on food production. From the fields that I'm in, which are in arts and humanities and behavioral sciences, there was more research that had come out of anthropology, especially around African Americans. And so over time, like I said, I started this work in the 90s. We're now 30 years out. And one of the things that gave rise to my new book was the amount of the number of shifts and changes that have been happening in the food world, right? We've sort of returned to this countercultural concept of growing your own food, which is not new at all, right? We go through this cycle every couple of decades. Dollar stores, et cetera, started getting refrigeration, and lots of other things started happening. And one of the things that I saw was the preponderance of people asking me questions about other people's eating from positions of moral authority, right? And quite frankly, a lot of them were in the field of public health. How do we get people to stop doing this? How do we get people to start doing this? How do we just get people to, and oftentimes it was around this position of, we just need to help people eat better, which is a very reductionist, as we know, concept, because decision-making around food is multifaceted, it's complex, multi-layered. And so I basically decided 10 years later that I needed to complete this book on food shaming. And I pretty much, because a lot of those conversations were coming to me from white women, but also from within the Black community. And I essentially argue in my book that this is a project of anti-Black racism. And so I look forward to talking about the social determinants of health, because, I absolutely know that they exist, but I also think we give food a lot of heavy lifting, where structural and social inequalities should be taking the onus for some of the reasons for Black and brown people's ill health.
I completely agree. And I would say that I'm almost coming another way around to where Dr. Williams-Forson is speaking, because I have a class that I'm teaching now, and a couple weeks ago we had a lecture on Jim Crow, and part of it was not just the essence of the laws and the quote unquote Jim Crow etiquette, but the constant barrage of anti-Black racist imagery, can't even say that word. And just when you juxtapose like the essence of the Mamie character, the servitude who's always bringing the quote unquote fried chicken and everything, this Southern food in the sense that she made so well, because out of like this whole idea of like, you had to be kind of a genius to kind of take the scraps and make something out of it. And subsequently the quote unquote planters enjoyed that food. And so all of that is so intertwined to what we see now, even if you go in areas that are not just quote soul food, but it's just ubiquitous now in terms of where it is in the United States. And so seeing how all of that is intermessed, that there's such a cultural presence that you can't just like Dr. Williams-Forson was saying, just look at these quote unquote social determinants of health and say, oh, well, these poor food choices. There's so much of a cultural aspect that just kind of been threaded throughout the generations. And it's very hard to disentangle.
Cultural and historical, absolutely, Dr. Roberts, right? I mean, Black people, we have a long history of food in this country and countries prior to coming here. And part of what I do in my work is to dispel myths that, first of all Black women can cook, because they can't. And many of them died at the hands of enslavers and enslaver wives because they didn't know how to cook. But at the same time, Africans came to this country with a vast storehouse of knowledge around agriculture. We have to remember that enslavement was a system. It was an economic system. It was a racial system. It was a cultural system. And we were brought to this country. Our ancestors were brought to this country on the basis of various types of knowledge that they had: indigo growing, agricultural skill and knowledge, cotton production, of course, tobacco, all the things that helped to build this country. And so to then move into Reconstruction and before Reconstruction, and then through Jim Crow and civil rights and into the 21st century, when the first African-American president who sat at the White House was described with a postcard circulating with watermelons on the South Lawn, right? These things are very real. They're very ever present. And so if we think food alone is killing Black people after centuries of trauma in this country at the hands of white supremacists, if we think that it's food that's killing Black people because we are underemployed, often underskilled, often without running water or adequate water in Jackson, Mississippi, in Flint, Michigan, because we are killed by feet on our neck and jogging in the park and waking up in the morning. If you think food is the thing that's killing us, we should probably have a different conversation, because that's in the litany of things that are killing us in this country. Food is one small part. And I dare people and defy people to continue to put food at the forefront, because that erases the hard work that we have to do to dismantle the systems of racism in this country.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm sorry, did I cut you off? No? Okay.
No, I just stopped. I felt like I was on a rant. Stop.
No. We're here to have this discussion. Yeah, it's really, heart-wrenching to consider the realities of where we are. And I completely agree. If we're still saying that food is the issue, we have to have a different conversation. I think, so we've talked a little bit about historically how the role of race and racism has, played in the way that food systems have been constructed. I would say that, what would you predict in terms of progress for the next 5 to 10 years? Are you seeing research coming out or, publications coming out that support any change?
I don't know, Dr. Roberts, what are you seeing? What are your students reading?
Well, not specifically looking at food systems and looking at how that will, it's because it's so, I don't know, we often look backwards in terms of the research that comes out, because we'll be like, oh yeah, this is what happened, and then we'll publish it today. So even something simple as we look back the last couple of decades and be like, oh yeah, our portion size is doubled, so now we'll talk about it. But so we don't necessarily be like, hey, in 2030 this is going to happen. Now sometimes that does happen, but I will say that today, I feel like for many scholars of a variety of disciplines, I think people are starting to actually be a little bit more critical and start to think a little bit more about the structures and the systems of racism and how that plays a role in their specific scholarship. So in essence, if that is happening, then it will play a role in how people look at food systems, look at access to food, look at the relationship of food with bodies. So I think that may actually, in essence, kind of roll into it, because I do feel from scholars and from things that I have been seeing with people all the way from sociology, even in kinesiology, we had a discussion today about dismantling kind of the white supremacist aspect of how we even look at kinesiology scholarship and how that is even taught. So even the pedagogy of it. So I think because so many disciplines are now starting to critically look at it, and even I've talked to bioengineers, how we even critically look, the why there's oximeters that we were using during the COVID we started the pandemic. I say it's the past term, how those were racially biased and calibrated in such a way that they misjudged the level of oxygen in Black bodies. So I think a lot of scholars in their discipline are looking at it, and so I hope, optimistically, even though I'm usually cynical, I hope optimistically in the next 5 years that people will now start to be a little bit more critical. At least these new scholars coming up, are these new students, our undergrads, our graduate students, now start to question, hey, why are we only testing this on white bodies? Or why are we only asking these questions? I hope that scholarship will evolve in such a way that we become with a very anti-racist kind of paradigm that will, in essence, improve many systems, including the food system.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah, I agree. You know, there's an anti-Black racism initiative on campus that comes out of sociology right now. And actually the School of Public Health is involved. I'm on the committee for that initiative, and we just submitted one of these many opportunities for a Grand Challenges grant, which are these big challenges that are, these big grants that are designed to affect change and address a big question. And so 5 schools have come together: Arts and Humanities, BSOS, which is Behavioral Sciences, Education, Public Policy, and the Center for Health Equity in the School of Public Health. So we've all come together and crafted a proposal for an anti-Black racism initiative. And just in the College of Arts and Humanities alone, I know the reason that this is absolutely necessary. As I was soliciting courses from my colleagues for the minor, because a minor is a part of this, of the larger package, you know, folks were giving me lots of courses that dealt with African Americans. And I had to explain to people that just because you have a course around African Americans doesn't mean it's anti-Black, that anti-Black racism is dealt with. Perhaps it should be, but that's not always how people teach from a pedagogical point of view, as Dr. Roberts has pointed out. So I agree with you 100%. I'm hopeful that in the years to come, as more and more scholarship is coming out about contributions and survival strategies. You know, there was a book a couple of years ago that came out, I think it was Deborah Gant, who talked about the tomato trail, so that we understand how a tomato even lands on your plate. And so what does that mean in terms of migrant labor and, you know, growth processes and harvesting and wage labor and so forth. So I'm hoping, as Dr. Roberts said, as more and more disciplines have sprung up and are starting to address issues of food and to some extent food systems, because we don't always carry it all the way through, right? Sometimes we just take one portion of the conversation. But we're hopeful that as more and more scholars begin to address these issues, that we will start to see a shift and a change in our various professions. Everything from how you engage a food pantry, to who engages a food pantry, to just today, we got in Maryland today, I think they announced, if you visit the campus food pantry, that you now need to bring your own sustainable bag, recyclable bag. And that's problematic, because you have people who are unhoused who attend this campus who may not have recyclable bags, or who may not have a bag to fit a particular dimension. And so even as we have these conversations, we have to always kind of circle back and ask ourselves, why are we creating these policies, and who are they going to disadvantage in the process? And I think that's a step we often, like you were saying about the octometer, you know, when you're only appealing to one group of people, you have to question, how will this affect this community? How will this affect this community? How? From age to race to gender to sexuality to region, you have to ask those questions. And that's hard work. And most people don't want to do the hard work of culture.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that about the campus food pantry. That's a really interesting choice. I would like to, you've mentioned a little bit about it, but I think we could talk a little bit more about the pandemic and just how the COVID-19 pandemic has changed your scholarship, what you're seeing, you know, personally, and how it, affects your professional development and work. And I think more specifically, if the COVID-19 pandemic is presenting new challenges, or if it is just revealing, if it has mostly revealed, you know, pulled back the veneer off of challenges that have always existed.
I'll start with this one. I would say that in terms of the pandemic, and I really want to call it more of a period of a syndemic, because it just, so many things happened along with the issues of the coronavirus pandemic. We saw the pandemic of racism, which has always been there. And you just saw a convergence of all of these issues occurring, and many other issues that came about that were already issues. So issues with green space equity. So we saw that come out when everyone didn't have a park to go to when we were really locked down, or they didn't have a backyard to go, and get some reprieve when we were all shut down. Mm-hmm. So I think for me, my scholarship has become a little bit more emboldened with and unapologetic in terms of looking at anti-racist, looking at my scholarship from a very anti-racist lens. And talking about a lot of the work that I do most recently has been talking about this relationship between Black bodies and green spaces. And so really looking at that critically from the time that we were brought here, when our bodies were pilfered from Africa, and then how we had to just kind of create this new relationship to a foreign land that really was a land that was betraying us in every aspect. And so looking at people like make tongue-in-cheek comments like, oh, Black people don't hike, Black people don't go out, and to kind of go back and really scrub through that. So to kind of really unapologetically look at why the connection is with, a social determinant of health, such as a park or such as a green space. And so I would say that the pandemic has made me a little bit more emboldened with that. In terms of food, I found it fascinating because personally, I felt like me and my partner were eating out like more, not out, but getting food out more. And I'm like, am I eating more? And I'm like, maybe because I'm just home more. So just on a personal kind of anecdotal way. But I do think it really did make us think about how much as humans, the fellowship of eating, like I really missed that when I was like, I want to go to a restaurant and eat with people, even if I don't know you, just the chatter, and so the fellowship of it and showing how much that is an imprint into not just dining and not just getting the sustenance, but the process of getting that. So I think that was something that maybe a lot of people kind of realized that they took for granted, realized what they missed, and that, and so I would just see that how the waves of the pandemic, it shifted from like maybe like what you eat or who you eat with. But I can't, that's not a scholarship that I study. I can just only speak on that, anecdotally.
Right. Thank you for sharing that, because I had a similar set of experiences. First of all, I completed eating while Black during the pandemic. Because I knew that I needed to go up for promotion because I have a kid who's first year in college. And so I had to get through that process, right? And so for me, the pandemic forced me to have to grapple with this project in a way that I often didn't want to do, because it wasn't a book I wanted to write. It wasn't the fun book. It wasn't one that involved as much archival research, et cetera. At the same time, to your point, Dr. Roberts, I tell people this tongue in cheek, but it's very true, that for at least 2 months, my daughter ate probably from every country that existed, because we were ordering in food every other night because I didn't have the wherewithal to cook. Now, so having said that, gender became a factor. I did so many different podcasts and interviews over the pandemic about the ways in which food demand and the cooking for those in your household produced an incredible strain for the primary food provider, which often tends to be women. I did one interview where a woman was like, I have 5 kids. And she said, I'm cooking multiple meals a day and I'm burning out. And I think we were at that point 2 months into the pandemic. So you have that issue. Then, of course, we had to be thinking about kids who tended to get free and reduced lunch, who found themselves compromised because they had to choose between their health or to eat, right? And then we were confronted with people who had healthcare, who didn't have adequate healthcare. We were confronted with the murder of George Floyd. We were confronted with the murder of Ahmaud Arbery. We were confronted with January 6th. So now, talk about social determinants of health. You've got all this political stuff coming at you every day, all day, social media, from the news, you couldn't turn the news on or TV on without seeing something about these issues. And those things begin to affect your mental and physical health. Right. And so now you've got that issue. And so you were saying about eating more. Yeah, we're eating more because we're here locked to the TV, like, oh my God, I can't believe what is happening in front of my face. How can this be? I can't believe we're going back 50 years to the civil rights movement. We thought we had finished this, not to mention the fact that we were dealing with voting rights issues and watching Roe unfold in front of our faces, only to come to, last summer. So there was so much happening that absolutely affected our digestive systems. It affected how we access food, what we thought about food, not coming out of the pandemic, but just this past summer, sitting and seeing on television that there was a mass shooting in Buffalo, New York. And, I grew up in Buffalo and in rural Virginia. And so
Me too. I'm sorry.
Hey,
I grew up in Buffalo.
Oh my gosh, I live near Humboldt Parkway.
You know it, me too. I grew up on Eastwood, right off the main street next to Canisius College.
Yeah, my aunt I was up the street from Canisius, across from St. Mary's School of the Deaf.
Yes.
Florence Avenue. We got to talk. So you know what I'm about to say probably resonates very well with you, because when I heard it was in the Black community, I immediately said, oh my God, I hope it's not on Jefferson Avenue. Because growing up, that was our store.
Yes, yes.
Was our store, right? And so, we experienced the first Juneteenth celebration. Buffalo has one of the oldest Juneteenth celebrations in the nation, right? And so I grew up with that, and Kwanzaa, and carrying on. So to see Black people who have limited access, it's been a while since I've been to Buffalo, maybe a decade or two, but that was the store. And so to now read about, people didn't just lose lives, they lost access to a major food hub.
Yes.
Right. And so when you have all of these compounded in a sort of sense of, I never thought this would happen to us, I see a huge intervention there around, like I said, mental and physical health is an issue. And it just all came to a head, I think, in the last 2 years, quite frankly, in ways that reignite traumas and triggers that many Black people have about, or things that we've only ever read about around social and cultural violence, to see it come so close to home. So, I think all of those issues have definitely affected the scholarship. We also saw a lot more people growing during that period, container gardens, plots, etc. And that's great. But, as I shared with some people, I'll say this in closing, as I shared with some people, we shouldn't put too much emphasis on whether or not people are growing food or baking bread or what have you, because everybody's life is different. And some people were growing because they needed to see life, not because they wanted to eat the foods that they were growing,
Yeah.
So yeah, I do think it had an absolute impact on my scholarship in that way.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah, I think we can talk a little bit about, matters closer to home, as Dr. Williams-Forson was alluding to. I know back in 2021, there was a footbridge that collapsed in DC over 295, and that impacted how lower income DC residents in that area were able to access food for the entire amount of time that it was down.
Lower and middle, because that bridge connected the Benning Road area, right, to a new set of developments, condos right there along 295 that were, pretty much, some of them are Section 8, but a lot of them are more upscale housing. And so people who were trying to get back and forth to the metro, like you said, infrastructure now has, is impacting folks' health and so forth. So, and then we haven't even touched on gentrification and the number of displaced people during the pandemic, since the pandemic, who can't find places to live, let alone where they're going to eat, because they're priced out of a ridiculous housing market. And that's in our local communities.
The eviction, or even the evictions now.
Or the evictions.
Because now there's no longer the forgiveness.
That's right.
That's
right.
So it's just, and actually, it's also too early in the pandemic. It made me also think, it's very, very early on. Early in the pandemic, when we had the loss of the actor Chadwick Boseman, who was so young for colon cancer. And every time I think of colon cancer, I do think of food, but I also think of stress.
Absolutely.
Like it's the inflammation. There's stuff. It's not just food. So, and just for such a young person. And I remember there was like this flurry of people like, oh, do I need to get colon, which it should have always been going to get your colon. Do I need to get a colonoscopy? And then also people were like, well, I can't go now because we're locked down. And I remember a lot of people were like now trying to say, okay, well, the other test that's like, it's a box test that you provide a sample and then you mail it off using that. But I remember there was a whole lot of talk of colon cancer. And I was like, I wish we could have always talk about, these preventative measures, and not just when we had the loss of, a really prominent and high regarded actor. But it made me also think about that is a relationship, a cancer that has been related to food. And but I think the key thing is also it's culture and stress and all the other social the social below the skin level insults that you just constantly are just bombarded with as a Black man or Black woman living in this country,
which really made people afraid at times, I think, too, because gyms were shut down, but it made you afraid to go out to exercise. Right. I was living in Virginia at the time, in Northern Virginia, and quite frankly, aside from all the slithery things that cross paths in Virginia, because if you're on the neighborhood list, you'll hear every other day about a snake of some kind and calling the snake bird. So aside from that, it was very troubling to me to walk out on Telegraph Road, for example, because it's nothing to see different kinds of cars with different, again, markings. And because I study the material where I'm very keen on, and just growing up I grew up also in rural Virginia. So I went from Buffalo to rural Virginia. So it was nothing for us to see pickup trucks with gun racks and flags and so forth and so on. And because we were coming upon a changing of the guard, right, with regard to the executive branch and so forth, it was a very intense time. And so that began to affect your ability even to work out, outside. Or to want to go for a peaceful walk, and you dare not put on earbuds or anything because you would be, you couldn't hear what was going on around you. So there was a lot in the last 2 decades that we are still trying to, as we all know, work through and unfurl. And here we are at another election year. And everybody talks about the divisiveness, but it was always there. It's always been there. It just was similar to the civil rights movement when we got television, so we were able to see the dogs being sicked on Black people as they were peacefully marching. COVID shut us down, so we had to come face to face with the activities of what were happening in our world, which many of us experience on a day-to-day, month-to-month, year-to-year basis.
Yeah.
Absolutely. You touched on this briefly, but I'd like to explore it further, if that sounds good to you. Sort of the role in which healthcare professionals play in addressing the root issues of food insecurities and food systems in society, specifically in the DMV. To your point, Dr. Roberts, yes, colonoscopies are now being recommended for people in their 40s, which is, a huge growing public health issue because of all of the incidences of colon cancer that are appearing. And, I actually lost my aunt last month to colon cancer. And, due to, the inequities that exist in society in terms of how healthcare is tied to the capitalist structure and, inconsistent messaging about health and inconsistent availability of healthcare.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that. And you're definitely true, because it's very much, particularly as women, we will sometimes say, oh, I'm okay. I'm okay. We put ourselves last, like Dr. Williams-Forson was saying, the woman who was talking about she got 5 kids to cook for, like, I'm okay. And then sometimes by the time you say I'm okay, then you are not okay, and like you said, then there might be issues where I don't have insurance, or maybe I want to make sure I can pay for my 5 babies. first.
Right.
Then I will go, so it's a unfortunate circumstance that, that it's not that it's like healthcare is like it's a privilege as opposed to a right in this country. And speaking of the DMV, where food, specifically in Ward 7 and 8, where like it's 100% Black folks, and they're both Ward 7 and 8 are like food deserts, food swamps. Just I don't even know how. I think maybe there's like one grocery store compared to some of the other. I mean, per capita, like a ratio that's really wide compared to some of the other wards. And so when you live in that type of situation, yes, you may turn to foods that are, not as healthy, higher in calories, lower nutritional value, but you're like, if I could feed my 5 babies for like $15 and get them all this food, versus I'm gotta get on a bus to get to the closest grocery store. And then after I get a bus, now I got to take a cab because I can't really carry the bags on the grocery store. Like, you just add up all of those things that you need to just go get quote unquote healthy food. It's not a viable option for people. And then you think about who are those people who are living there. Like I said, those wards are like nearly 100% Black Americans. So it's just this ongoing cycle in terms of that as a social determinant of their health, their food options, their transit options to that food. Just because it also is a transit desert as well over there. So there's all these things that you can't just look at in isolation.
Right. And it's yes. And you said so many wonderful things that I want to tack on to, so I'll just choose a couple. My colleague and one of the folks that I mentor, Dr. Ashanti Reese, Reese, who has written a great book on DC. And I want to tell you what it is. And then she also has another one called Black Geographies with Hannah Garth. And her book is, but her first book, her single authored monograph, is Black Food Geographies, Race, Self-Reliance, and Food Access in Washington, D.C. And I bring her book up because she talks about Brentwood. It was her doctoral thesis, and she turned into the full-length manuscript. And she looks at Brentwood, she looks at acts of self-reliance and resiliency. Because as one of my colleagues long told us, grocery stores are not panaceas, right? And so, and when you think about it, I think health professionals often poo-poo and shun dollar stores and places like that. But in the final chapter, one of the final chapters of my book, Eating While Black, I talk about how do we eat in the meantime, right? What do we do, as Dr. Roberts was saying, when you have a family of 5 and they have to eat and you can't get access because you are in, what we have come to hear a lot of is a food desert or a transportation desert or pandemic or whatever the situation might be, right? And it's not just relegated to low income areas. I lived in Beltsville for over 15 years. And if I didn't have a car, I couldn't get to the closest grocery store. And it just so happened, one of the reasons I started this project is because I used to go to the Dollar Tree to get a whole kinds of carrying on for my daughter when she was a young kid and had to go to all these different parties. And I noticed that refrigeration was coming into the Dollar Tree and so forth and so on. And then I came upon a book by a woman who called the Dollar Tree Diva, the Dollar Diva. And she talked about her mother who was on a fixed income and how she would go to the dollar store and buy certain spices and beans and dry goods for her mom from there and supplement them with maybe foods from Aldi that were fresher, right? And so one of the things I think it's important that we do when we're having conversations about public health is to stop limiting how people access food, because people need to eat however they can. If it comes down to you needing to eat food from the dollar store so you could take your mental health medicine or diabetes or whatever the case may be, why are we telling people that those are not healthy options when they give you the opportunity to live? Meanwhile, we're waiting for Jackson, as I said, to get clean water and not have a bill for $17,000. a water bill that you're expected to pay, though you can't access the water, right? Or in Flint, Michigan, how long have we been talking about that? Right. So while we have to stop policing, I think, how people access food. Some people access through the bodega. Some people access through the corner store. Some people access from their grandparents' pantry. Some people access it from neighbors. Some people order out. There are so many different decisions on a daily basis that go into how we choose what we're going to eat, that it's really short-sighted of us, I think, to begin to tell people, oh, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't, here I am running onto this wonderful program, having come surprisingly from having to deal with my daughter getting a medical procedure today. You think that didn't affect how we're eating this evening, even though we live in two different places, right? So I think we stress people out trying to say, you need to do this, you need to do that. People have lives and they're very, very complex. And not all Black people eat soul food. Not all non-Black people don't eat soul food. We also have students in our midst who have a horrible time, especially when they're immigrants, trying to get foods that are going to help them thrive and survive, right? Because quiet as it's kept, eating local doesn't work for everybody. Especially it doesn't work for you if you're from outside of the United States and maybe even outside this region where particular foods are critical to your life force and you can't get access to them. Right. So I think we just have to be much more expansive in how we have conversations about food and remain pliable, because we're human and any number of us on any given day can encounter 1,000 different things that will affect how we eat. And what we eat. So I just try to open up the conversation and encourage us to be as broad in our thinking as possible.
Is this the same Ashanti that was she at Rhodes College?
I do think she was at Rhodes, and then she was at American. I think she was at Rhodes. She went to Spelman.
I think we've had lunch together. I think I met her through another friend. Because I was like, she does yoga and
yes, that's Ashanti. Yes.
Yes. When you said the food in DC, I'm like,
yeah.
I feel like she went to Rhodes for like
went to Rhodes, then she was after she left American, I think she went to Rhodes, then she was at Spelman. Now she's in Texas.
Okay.
So she's that same
too
person.
Much connection.
Right. And she's doing some fascinating work right now on food and prisons.
Yes.
Which should be coming out soon. But there's some wonderful work that's out there that's being done on like Soul Fire Farms and work that's being done on the food systems of reclaiming land, work that's being done by Lakota people to grow food in places on reservations that were previously unwelcome to the growth of their own food. So excuse me, so there are a lot of movements afoot to change how communities access food. And all I'm suggesting is, one, we not be reductionist in our thinking that food, eating good food is going to resolve all ills. Number one. Number two, that how people access food has to be much more varied than what we have been led to believe. I just need to shut the door a little bit.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing. Yeah, definitely. I think, as we get, and we talked about this as we set up the questions for this event, as you get into it, it becomes sort of this rabbit hole, right? Because you can't talk about food systems without talking about race, without talking about gender, without talking about how from start to finish, all different systems we interact with are affected.
Right. That's part of what makes food a part of a system, right? That's one of the many ways in which it's a system. I'll just share this with people. Food is a big topic. And I think when I started out, it was very narrow and very localized to just studying about cooking and who cooked. But food conversations are really big and they're multifaceted, as I just said. The historian Ray Tannehill once wrote, the ability to have food choices is really a privilege of the moneyed. Because when you don't have a lot of money, you don't have a lot of options to stray from what you know. And so I just would again say part of that system is tied to capitalism, is tied to needing a working class so that you can have a ruling class or a wealthy class. And there was a study out of UC Davis about maybe a decade ago now that argued actually the more money you make, the more you actually eat out, right?
Yeah.
You may not be eating fast food, but you may be eating at Kava, or you may be eating at, Meza, or you may be eating at, Blaze, or some place, or, or Ruth Chris, or whatever, or Whole Foods even, and you're not really buying foods to prepare, you're buying foods that are already prepared. And so I think we have to begin to change this notion that it's only working class and poor people who don't eat well, because the same study argued that the majority of us don't eat enough fruits and vegetables, but we always put the lens on working class and poor people. And we also tend to associate race with that. So it becomes translated to Black.
Yeah.
As if all Black people in America are working class and poor. Many of us are, the majority of us maybe are, but that's not all of us. And even those of us who may be struggling every day financially, find ways to be creative around food. You only have to go on Facebook or Instagram, and you can see the number of people responding to everything from Men in the Woods to, cooking with Chef Joya or whatever, vegans, vegetarian, pescatarian, because everybody wants a label. And you begin to see that there's just a plethora of options and choices that people are making, including myself. Hello, at McDonald's, can I get a number 7, the fish fillet? Yeah, including those of us who are moving about, or can I get my coffee because I'm on my way to campus? And we need to not, fool ourselves about that. Very few of us live pure lives.
Correct.
If any of us, right?
Yes. I don't know anyone who does.
I don't know anyone who does, but I think people deceive themselves into thinking they're good people because they eat under a label.
Yeah.
When there's a wonderful documentary that you can Google on YouTube right now called Behind the Kitchen Door. Saru Jaraman. It's called Behind the Kitchen Door, and it's taken from the title of her book, where she shows you what happens in the restaurant industry, especially when you think you're going to the upscale organic restaurant. Everything from the hostess who's underpaid, to the waitress who's underpaid, to the people in the kitchen who are working with H1N1 and who don't have any health insurance, to the women who are often experiencing sexual harassment. But all of that in the name of getting you your organic wine and your wonderful salad. So the question kind of becomes, how clean are your hands, right? So I think we need to be very cognizant when we're working with people about how we are projecting these labels and how we're projecting our own values and judging when other people's values don't meet our realities.
Yeah, I completely agree. So much of a judgment that we do that with everything.
With everything.
It's just everything. Whether it's from physical activity, you do enough, you don't do enough. You do it this time, you do it. It's just we're constantly judging. We're judging food, which it's just too much, and you sometimes as the judger, I think you should step back and be like, where is that coming from? Why? Which I think it's coming from a source of where you want to just turn around and judge yourself for something that maybe you don't feel good that you did or didn't do, but you just constantly just putting that out on someone else. It's just such a toxic existence that you have to sometimes really just leave it and go to your, like I go into my own home and just kind of get away from it.
That's right. No, that's right. It is very toxic, and it adds to the stress of
Yeah.
trying to live as a citizen, as a whole citizen, and be accepted in a society that was not designed for you, but built by you.
Mhm.
Right. And so, that sort of day-to-day, and I, again, and I talk about this in Eating While Black, that it's not just, these are not external forces when you're talking about Black communities. These are also internal forces, right? There are folks who make these judgments upon one another within groups,
Mhm.
without knowing the whole of folks' lives, right? Like, how do we get people to stop doing this? Or how do we get people to and then maybe a different question is, how do we help people to thrive? And what way will, their food consumption choices, discarding, what have you, preparation, knowledge, all of the things that we know, how does all of that work together to help them to survive?
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's interesting, this, tug of war between the external stressors and the internal stressors that are, being perpetuated. They sort of feed into each other back and forth. It becomes this like really vicious, toxic cycle. What would you recommend to folks who are sort of struggling with cultural and racial structural issues with as they relate to food shaming, and how can they move towards food enjoyment and sort of strengthened relationships in their internal circles?
Go ahead. Take that one.
That one's hard for me, because the structure of the question, I don't think you did this intentionally, Jameson. I think it's just how it rolled off your tongue, and how it's like when you say, what would you do? It's almost like putting the onus on the person who's getting shamed. That's, and it's interesting, because I think it triggered something in me from literally all the way from third grade. Okay. Like I went way back. So I was like this kid, I was quiet, but sometimes I got my grandmother's tongue, and it would just, things would come off all wrong. And I'll never forget, there was a little boy in my class, his name was Ali Khan. And he used to bring homemade lunches to school that was filled with curry and just all types of Indian types of spices I was not exposed to. And I remember I was like, what is that? Why does your lunch smell? Just a horrible response. Just imagine the 8-year-old girl saying, what is that? Why does your lunch smell like that? Right. And he was like, my mom made it. And I remember, and I think back, and I always wish that I could go I think we did bump into each other like later in 20s. And I think I apologized. He was like, I don't even remember that. But I was like, I remembered it. But anyhow, I think about like something as simple as that. It was coming from a source of innocence for me, but not so much. But anyhow, I think that this whole ideal of food shaming, it's not the onus of the person getting shamed. Like, it wasn't the onus of him to explain what his mom had made for him. It's like almost like early on to expose people to different types of foods, expose kids to different types of foods from different cultures, different ways to prepare food, just all these things. And then to also, even because you can only expose so much, but then even still, you said to teach people to not shame people for the choices that they make, and just that's a basic, like, it doesn't even have to be the food, just to teach people not to shame, and so I don't ever want to put the onus on the people who are constantly getting shamed by just food, and food is, it's an intimate relationship at oftentimes, and to shame someone, it's almost like shaming, well, not almost, but it's an intimate relationship. So you don't want to shame someone for something that's very personal for them. It could have been something that a loved one prepared for them. It just, whatever, and it just kind of, it makes me icky. And I think it's because I just go back to that 8-year-old little girl, and I was like, I did that to Ali Khan. And he obviously, we're 48. He is not remembering that. He didn't remember when we were 20, but it's just one of those things that I'm like, no, that's not good. And, and just to teach our kids to not be in that type of way, to not shame. You could ask things curiously, be like, wow, that looks interesting, but to not shame someone for something that is so personal.
Sure.
And so needed. It's like food. We need it.
And also, and to add to that, I think so much of that conversation is embedded in our educational system in general. I wrote a piece recently for Teen Vogue online, where I was asked to share a segment from my book, and the segment I shared had to do with my daughter. Something she told me during the pandemic when we were talking about the project, and she reminded me that when she was in 3rd or 4th grade, her gym teacher told all the students to get on the scale one by one, and then read their weight out as they got off the scale. This is boys and girls. So imagine the shame and the horror, right? Because then he turned to them and said something like, most of you are not going to be here. You're not going to grow to see old age because you're going to die of obesity. And it was and I remember when my daughter told me, and of course I had to go up to the school and have a word with the principal, and nothing happened, of course, because we're so ingrained and we have such a shortage of teachers that we're like, oh, we can't fire this teacher for making such an asinine statement. But this teacher should have known, first of all, you don't ask any child to get on the scale in front of their peers at that age, at a critical age of self-development. And then to make such a comment. And we're in Prince George's County, predominantly Black county. You have Black and brown children. Many of the girls are hippie, genetically or for various reasons, my daughter among them. And she was very shamed by that.
Yeah.
Her dad is from West Africa. And, we grew up in she grew up in a Ghanaian American household. And so she would take rice and sauce because he would make her lunch. And then she said, I had to stop, Mom, because I felt embarrassed because the other kids are like, what is that? Or think about if you're Japanese and your parents are from Japan, where the obento box, right, is part of what defines you as a good citizen in some instances. And so you bring obento boxes with these elaborately made meals and little notes from your parents, and all the other kids are like, oh my God, what is that? It could be imitation crab meat, it could be whatever. Right, kimchi, oh, I don't, whatever. And like you said, we are shaming at that age, but that starts at home. And it starts at home from being exposed to not just food, but a variety of cultures, and understanding and appreciating that you're not the only person in this world. You live in a global society, and that your inability to engage people from around the world could ultimately have a number of different impacts on your life, including employment-wise, right? And so we shouldn't be shaming people for anything, right? And we do this often inadvertently when we push a particular way of eating, when we push particular ways of not eating, and when we don't acknowledge the beauty of a multifaceted, multicultural, and I don't mean that in the way that we buzz it, but in a multicultural society. Because quiet as is kept, if you are spoused or partnered, you live in a multicultural household. You did not grow up with that person. Chances are you met along the way. So you're coming with 2 different cultures. You got maybe different religions. You certainly have different family dynamics, unless you're related, in which case we got some other issues, but stuff like that. And so quiet as kept, you can look just like me and still be culturally different, as was my, former husband. We both look pigment-wise the same, but his diet was decidedly Ghanaian and mine was decidedly rural Virginia, and so helping people be okay with, well, we're going to do pizza one night, but then we're going to do tuna, or we're going to do meatless Monday, or we're going to do whatever the case we have to do. But you're broadening people's palates and their minds.
Yes.
And their minds.
Definitely. Sort of segueing to a different facet of of our topics of conversation and our questions. Can we talk a little bit about the educational system and how food systems affect the educational system and children's health specifically?
Okay, I'll say this very quickly. I'll make my comments very brief. In Eating While Black, I have a discussion of a young middle school girl by the name of Latricia Avery, who was spotlighted in the Washington Post a couple of decades ago under the banner of an article called Young Lives at Risk, and it was about obesity in the Washington, D.C. area, so in the DMV. And they focused on a lot of different children and pretty much shamed them. They had pictures of them, and so forth. So there was a video picture expose that was attached that you really can't access now. I have to be honest. I've tried. Thankfully, I screenshotted all the pictures, but it's hard to access. But the long story short, this young lady was teased every day because she was tall, very dark skinned and very heavy set at 12. And the article said her friends would call her King Kong, or people in her class would call her King Kong. And the article goes on to talk about some of those social determinants of health, right? That she lived in Ward 7 or 8, right? And she'd have to walk home past the liquor store and the Popeyes. And so she had all these influences that were affecting her. And the thing that really they came down to is she just didn't have the willpower to write her diet and get the necessary exercise, doing calisthenics and stuff. And so she was, long story short, going to die at a young age. And so I do an unpacking and a reading of it, because that young girl could have been my daughter, right? Or it could be any of our child, really. And the thing that was problematic for me is the article focused on all of her ills, not the fact that, from my reading, quite frankly, she very well may have been in foster care. Because I looked at her clothes, which were the same in every issue, but I looked at her undergarments, which weren't not very supportive. I looked at what the other kids had on and realized that though they're the same colors, they're not the same. So my point simply is, children are affected every day. My daughter's doing a paper right now on trauma-informed schools, and she found that in Prince George's County, there's like 166 school resource officers in schools in PG County, compared to Montgomery County, where there's 22 in the whole county. I heard this morning on the news that in Arlington County schools, what did they say? Though Black and brown children make up 10% of the population in Arlington, they are 37% more likely to be suspended from school. If they have disabilities, they are 50% more likely to be suspended from school. If you are telling me that food is an issue, when you've got those kinds of dynamics going on in our county schools, again, we have major problems, and we don't give our teachers enough pay. I finally had to leave the county, quite frankly, and move my daughter to Fairfax County in the middle of COVID, because PG County refused to give her some services that she needed. And so again, I don't know. That's why I have eating in the meantime, because there's so many issues that have to be unpacked and addressed there, that we should not be making people feel bad about their lives. This young lady that I spotlight, where was her mom? Where was her dad? Where are her grandparents? If you read carefully, you heard she was being raised by a caretaker. That suggests to me foster care or a fictive kin of some sort. And the article just hammered and hammered and hammered. She eats, this is what she eats, and it's too much food. Essentially, she's eating ham and I'm not saying that they weren't right. Her plate was way heavier than it should have been, probably. But I'm like, but also what's happening in her life that is prompting her to eat such amounts of food? They said once a week. Is she hungry at school? Is she traumatized? Is anybody looking at her mental health? Is she on medication for mental health that has caused her to gain weight, which is causing her a great deal of embarrassment? So there's so many different questions that we have to ask, I think, for our young people.
Yeah, I completely agree. And going back to the school situation, so my mom graduated. She retired last year. She worked over 40 years in the Buffalo public school system. And she constantly was supplementing. She would be bringing in granola bars, all kinds of snacks, because she was like, my kids are hungry. She taught always fourth grade, couple years it was fifth grade. She's like, my kids are always hungry. She'd bring in apples and cut them up, and she would be like, and they were famished, you know.
Yeah.
And so there's that issue in the sense that the kids are coming to school famished. And, you know, as Dr. Williams-Forson said, during the pandemic, we saw how a lot of kids were being compromised because they didn't have that breakfast and that lunch meal that they were getting, you know. And so there's that issue. But then also going back to the spotlight of the child that you were just talking about, it always makes me think too, because there's a lot of times there's so many issues of stressors and racial insults and distressors of just living life, that sometimes food is the only reward, the only source of pleasure. I remember, so when I was, you know, a kid, like kindergarten, pre-K, first grade, it was just my mom and I. My mom was trying to go to grad school at Kinesiology College, and my grandmother, she worked as like a school aide, but she would take like 3 buses to come to our house, and she would have a big old bag. She'd bring in her collard greens, her mustard greens. I mean, when I say she would cook, and it was just me. I'm like 5 or 6, so there's only so much I can eat. And then my mom, and then grandma, but she would be cooking. And this is like every Friday, or actually every other Friday when she got paid. It would be so much food. And she'd go to Federal Meat Market, she'd get them food. And she'd be on the bus, and she'd come walking down the street, because the bus let you off at the corner of Main East. She's walking down the street with all of this. Sometimes if it was a little extra money, she could take a cab, but she was just cooking. And I was just to be like, why does it feel like Thanksgiving? But that was my grandmother's way of being like, you know, I may not be able to like get new clothes for the baby. I may not be able, we don't own a house. I don't have a car, but I'm gonna make sure this baby has food. And she'd be like bacon, like there'd be like sweet potato pie, like it was Thanksgiving, you know. But I think that was her way of being like, I'm gonna take care of this baby through her gut, you know. And it was just, it was a cultural thing, or a grandma thing. I don't know, but I think she would feel rewarded and happy when I would be eating, you know, and I'd be happy, be like, oh, grandma, you gonna make your homemade rolls, and I'd be happy, and this and that. And so I think sometimes, you know, we have to think about, with all these other stressors, maybe the food is the source of joy, and the source of like, you know what, I can really just kind of not think about all those other issues, and just enjoy the taste, just enjoy the person who made it for me, just enjoy it just for a moment, and not even think about all of the other issues that I have to deal with. So
Right.
it could have been another issue that that young girl was
I
dealing with.
agree. I mean, one of the pieces of that article was that she used to cook with her caretaker once a week. And the article went on to sort of condemn what they were eating, but they used the words of the caretaker, who said, well, it's probably my fault because I blah, blah. But no one focused on the fact that that was cultural continuity. She's passing on to this young woman how to cook, certain foods to cook, certain ingredients to use. And in those bonding moments, that could have been times when that young lady felt okay to open up.
Yes.
And decompress and get out the trauma, because the likelihood of her being in therapy is probably low. Right. She made a blouse one time. She sewed a blouse, this young girl, and they focused on the fact that she had to she couldn't wear it to Easter Sunday church because the buttons were too tight, because she had gained a little weight, rather than focusing on the fact that she had learned a skill. And that's what I mean by anti-Black racism connected to food, because we should be celebrating this young girl and other young children like them for those accomplishments throughout the life of lots of what it seemed to me adversity. Right. Instead, we're talking about there's not enough green spaces, and she lives in this, but you know, the question, she lives in an area that is poverty stricken, and she's, you know, her mother once said, you know, I'm concerned because there's a lot of gun violence. Well, where is that mother? Why isn't she living with that mother? Is she incarcerated? Because now you've added another layer, right, of incarceration of Black and brown people in masses, and especially women, right? But all of that to say, you know, we grew up in as I said, where we lived in Buffalo, but my dad worked in the fruit belt. right? At Build Academy and the community center down there. And so with 3 young people, my mom was trying to go to Buff State and all that, or UB actually. And oftentimes we had government cheese.
Yes.
I remember the slab of government cheese, the block, right? And having to cook it, cut it off and make, cheese sandwiches or powdered milk, right? And so my point simply is that how people acquire food really kind of sort of should not be anyone else's business, because also in those transitions, people are learning about culture, about resiliency, about survival. Quiet as is kept, Black folks did not come to this country eating scraps. We went through 3 generations, 3 centuries of enslavement. We did not get off of a boat with agricultural knowledge, come to a place filled with forests and not know how to forage. You got to be kidding me.
Yeah.
We didn't start learning how to be resilient with food yesterday. We knew how to pick berries. We knew how to watch deer. We knew how to trap turtles. We knew how to trap mice. We knew how to skin snakes. We knew how to survive as it relates to food. We may have been given 2 pecks of meal and some low cuts of meat. That didn't necessarily mean that's all we ate. We knew how to bury sweet potatoes in the ground and keep them cold throughout the year. We knew how to spot poke salad, pokeweed, and how to cook it correctly so it didn't kill us. We knew how to get other kinds of wheat. Black folks have always known how to do things with food, even if we didn't know exactly how to cook it. Some of us know how to forage,
yes,
and hunt and fish and other ways of survival. So nowhere in our history have we only ever done one thing as it related to food. So we should really kind of stop trying to have that conversation today. Or in today's times, not tonight.
Absolutely. What would you recommend to folks on the call this evening who are beginning to explore how food systems impact their lives?
Impact their lives, or the people, or the lives of the people, and the lives of the people with whom they interact? One of the first things I think you should do is read about people's histories. Hasia Diner has a wonderful book. She's a historian of Jewish foodways and culture, and she has a book called Hungering for America, and it's about Jewish, Irish, and Italian foodways and why those immigrant communities came to the U.S. and how food was a pull factor. Okay. Donna Gabachia has a similar kind of book about ethnic foodways, right? Keller Brown and K. Marcel have a book called Regional and Ethnic Foodways, where it's just what it says. It's about different ethnicities, primarily white ethnicities, and their food cultures. There's a new book out, an anthology on eating Asian American. I think people need to read. Frederick Opie has written a book called not High on the Hog. That's Jessica Harris, and some of you all may have seen her Netflix documentary. But Fred Opie, OPIE, has a book out on African American food culture. My point simply is that doing some reading about people's cultural food processes can go far toward the area of study that Dr. Roberts primarily deals in, which is the social determinants of health. Getting to those factors and understanding how culture intersects, I think can help you get a more complete picture, not only of your own food cultures, but of those with whom you interact on a daily basis and perhaps serve. There's lots of scholarship that has come out in the last 3 decades. Those are just some of the books that I would suggest you take a look at that are overview enough to give you some really good histories on why people practice certain cultural practices and how those cultural practices, as Dr. Roberts rightly notes, are very near and dear to people's hearts. So when you talk about dismantling people's food systems, you may as well tell them to give you their cell phone. Honestly.
Good analogy.
Yeah, because that's how powerful it is, right? Verda May Grosvenor, who's a culinary historian, PBS producer, wrote a long time ago that people will change their language, you'll change your name, you may even change your clothing, but your food culture, whether you're from Appalachia or you're from Arkansas, Texas, New England, Indiana, Illinois, the Deep South, wherever you're from, your food culture is going to give away so many different dynamics of your life, your class, probably your region, and certainly your ethnicity. And I say that deliberately because not all Black people are Black from America, right? And so understanding those nuances better help you to understand the complexities of human life, and definitely the ways in which those social determinants end up affecting our humanness.
I couldn't agree more. I don't even know have anything else to add to that, but I say definitely learn, read. It's a constant process, because you'll find something else and then you'll leapfrog to another topic. But I didn't know that. And so I think definitely constantly educating yourself and exposing yourself to things and cultures and people that, you may not have, known about, I think that's one of the best ways for anyone to grow.
Absolutely. I've been trying to feverishly take notes while listening. I think I got most of the texts that you've referenced.
I'll send them to you. I'll send you a short
I will
bibliography.
confirm. I'll have a list because I know that for who asked, and the folks on the call, for those who asked in the chat, we will be sure to share that list of texts and resources with the registrants for tonight's event.
Right.
I do want to get to a question or two from the audience. I know that we are running a little short on time, but are you okay to go a couple minutes over?
Yes. I can do it.
Okay. So one of the questions that came in from the audience, could you talk a little bit about how respectively your work intersects with the body positivity movement?
Say that question one more time.
Sure, absolutely. One of the questions asked from the audience was that for you to discuss how the body positivity movement intersects with your work, or how you encounter it.
I'll let you answer first, because I don't think mine's really intersecting, but I'll let you answer first.
Okay. I encounter it a lot on social media, right? How does my work intersect with body positivity? I think that in my experience, how a person thinks about themselves directly affects how they think about themselves. Okay. What do I mean by that? If I feel like I'm thriving, I'm more inclined to also, and my life has some order to it, I'm more inclined to want to, move and do all the different things that I want to do, not for the purposes of losing weight, but for the purposes of increasing that longevity of endorphins, right? Absolutely, there are people who are morbidly obese. And I would venture to say that some of the body positivity is an attempt to just make it through another day, right? Because they may not know what they need to do, or they may be looking down the pike of, I know my life is not going to be long, or my grandmother died at 50, or my uncle or my mom or whomever. So I think we, again, should have conversations with people around body positivity. There was a tweet a while ago of a swim party, and it was mostly African-American and Black and brown women. It was called Swim Thick, THICC. And the number of comments that just were horrible in the chat, in the comment section, just ugly comments. And you have to ask yourself, what is it about me being okay with me that is disturbing and problematic for you? You have the option to keep on scrolling, but instead you're taking time out of your day to tell me how horrible I look. That's not about me. That's everything about you. For whatever reason, you feel like you need to comment on how I feel I look for myself. And so I think for many people, it's like, if we accept that, then you're a strain on our healthcare, and you're a strain. There's so many things that are straining our healthcare, including the fact that so many people are without healthcare. Okay, let's be clear. That my wearing a bikini and I'm feeling good in it, even though I may have bulges and rolls, has nothing to do with you. And so that's how my work intersects. I consider that people are dealing with different factors in their lives. And if that's what makes them feel good, then they should have at it. It's not my place as a cultural historian to tell somebody else, you're obese and you look horrible. In fact, I think that's very problematic. There was an article in the New York Times a while back from a colleague who said Black women want to be fat, PHAT. And it caused a furor. It was in the New York Times. It was about maybe 8 years ago. And there's this problem.
I remember that article.
You remember that article? And it's a problematic assumption because it tends to occlude the fact or ignore the fact Black women do exercise, right? And we also have different body types and we enjoy different foods. And my God, do we have to take away joy from people? You know, so people were like, you have girl track, you have Black girls run, you have all these, you have gyms, you have all these ways that people are taking advantage of living their lives, that I just don't think we need to add to the chorus by blaming people for having different body types that are not desirable to us.
Yeah, and I would say that my work doesn't directly intersect with body positivity. I can say that my work does constantly interrogate the white centrality of beauty standards, or the white centrality of standards of what is ideal or whatever it is. And I also, my work will also reveal many of the kind of the relationship between scientific or medical racism and the kind of the fundamentals of how we look at Black bodies, specifically Black women bodies. So I often will make reference to the woman, Sarah Sarti Bartman, who was a woman from South Africa who was brought just to really be exploited and prostituted, but she was known for having an enlarged buttocks, and ultimately when she died, she was well, autopsy, but I want to say dissected, because they took every pretty much her genitalia, everything, because it was just really just to kind of perpetuate this whole ideal of Black women being like animals and apes. And I think even the man Collier, who was the one, is a French zoologist who did the autopsy, I think he said she had more features of an ape than anything he had seen. But in any case, just that continuous kind of like those that continuous like white supremacist medical or scientific racism to continue perpetuate the fact that Black bodies, Black minds are inferior, that are animal-like. So I guess that's close as I would get to any body positivity, but I do actually, then I'm lying. I do have a student who her dissertation actually is working on that. She's looking at the relationship of yoga, of Black women engaged in yoga and like the history of yoga in this country in relation to Black body images. So I guess tangentially, not my work, my students' work. So
tell her about Stephanie Evans. I'm sure she knows her work, but if she doesn't, she absolutely has to look at Stephanie Evans's work.
Okay.
And along those lines, you know, you reminded me that I had a student who looked at the Black ballet, Black belly dancers, many of whom are very full of figure and are very erotic in their presentation and performance, right? As voluptuous, because that's part of what allows their body to move in very sensual ways, as opposed to being read as unruly and out of control.
Yes.
There is a book called The Unruly Black Body as well, that might be of use to your student.
Okay.
Yeah, The Unruly Black Body. And I believe she does a deep dive historically and then comes forward with how we got to that including
Okay.
the work of Sanjay, including Sarjay Bart.
Great. Yeah. Body positivity becomes toxic very quickly.
Oh, very quickly. Yeah.
Yeah. Um,
For all of us.
yeah, for all of
Yeah,
us.
for all of us.
For all of us.
Yeah.
We're getting, I know we're running on over time. One more question to close with. How can Terps, both students and alums, help to be a part of solutions, close to home in the DMV on and around campus?
Mhm.
I think for one, like coming to like forums like this to kind of, I mean, you got a whole book list now to go and read from, just hearing the conversation. And I think just to constantly educate themselves, and constantly almost self-criticize yourself for any kind of way that you are thinking, because you're like, well, why do I think that way? And so I think just that critical thinking, and something simple as like what Dr. Williams-Forson had said earlier, like the whole ideal of now at the pantry having to bring a sustainable bag, having someone to critically interrogate them, be like, well, why? Or if, okay, let's have a compromise. If you are able to, can you bring a second bag to share and lend for somebody else? Maybe that's a compromise. So to kind of do those kinds of things, you find some low-hanging fruit that you can insert yourself on and help, and then you think of things that are maybe a little bit longer down the road. But I think don't expect to fix things in one day, but give yourself a little bit of grace and try to just kind of constantly educate and have stimulating conversations, and hopefully things can get better.
Yeah, I haven't taught this course in a long time, but I because I'm doing other administrative things, but I want to get back to it very quickly. Food trauma and sustainability, and we would always part of our initiative. It was a design thinking course, and so part of our initiative was to engage with an organization in and around the Prince George's County area. So the first year we did Meals on Wheels, and our students worked with elderly clients. In the second year, we took on the campus pantry when they were first getting organized. So to add to what Dr. Roberts has said, I think all of those are good ideas. People should consider how many spaces on campus have microwaves where students who are transfer or who are commuter or who are unhoused can go to heat up food during the day, right? Just things like cup of noodles. And how does that information get shared with those various populations? The library now has the whole nap pods that you can do, but there's really nowhere that I'm familiar with, and it's quite possible I just don't know, that where people can go and have access to a microwave. We in American Studies a couple of years ago started putting food baskets on every floor, and we keep dry goods in there, everything from cup of noodles to granola bars. And when possible, we offer fresh food options as well when we have a program or what have you. And we invite our students in to bring a friend. If you want or need food, grab something during the day. My students would do a locavore challenge, because they used to be very flippant about the fact that people should be able to eat local. Then they had to, find out that local and organic are not the same thing. So just because you go to Whole Foods and you get organic food, it may not be local. Or if you go to Mom's, or when it used to exist on campus, the food co-op, those foods may or may not be. So helping students to tease through and work through their assumptions, encouraging our colleagues to get involved with places like Miss Gloria Aprecio's office, where she does work in local communities. Prince George's County has a food equity council that anyone can be a part of. So there are lots of different ways. There's the Do Good initiative coming out of public policy, where they help folks in the community to recycle foods that are in danger of being discarded, and then they get repackaged and given away. So there's lots of initiatives that people can get involved in if you Google them, and especially if you Google them within Prince George's County, which is of course where Maryland is situated. So
Great. Thank you so much. This conversation was so informative and so helpful. Thank you so much for taking the time. We really appreciate your effort, your energy, your skills, and your scholarship. And most specifically your time and being available after hours. As a network of volunteers, we love to engage with other folks who are interested in volunteering and having informative, open dialogues with us. For those who attended tonight's event, thank you so much for attending. We hope you enjoyed this discussion. There will be a list of resources that were compiled during this conversation sent around. As we mentioned at the beginning, this conversation was recorded. It will be posted to the School of Public Health Alumni channel. The School of Public Health YouTube channel, and we will send it around to the folks who registered. For folks who registered, there will also be a survey. It's between 3 and 5 questions long, asking you how we did, asking you about the logistics and the content of tonight's programming. Your feedback's really important to us. It helps us to inform other programming down the line. So please, when you receive that email, don't delete it. Fill out the Google form. We appreciate your time as well. And thank you to, I'm not sure if Cassie Dua is still on, but president of the University of Maryland Black Alumni Network. Thank you so much for your partnership. Thank you to the School of Public Health staff who showed up tonight and helped us in promoting our event over the last 6 weeks or so. Thanks to everybody who participated, and we will be in touch.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you for having us. Two
Absolutely.
Buffalo girls.
I know.
Yeah,
We'll be in touch. I know.
Yes.
Who knew? Who knew?
Wonderful.
Great. Thank you all so much.
All right.
Okay.
Have a good
see you
evening, everyone.